love telling stories about their founding. Some started with empires, others with a revolution, and a few with peace treaties that no one really cares about. These stories shape how nations see themselves and how they want to be seen. But if you look closely, almost every country has a gap between what it teaches and what really happened. History isn't about what happened, it's about what gets remembered. And memory, when controlled, becomes power. And this man knows it better than anyone else. Ask a Tibetan what it's like to lose their home. Ask a Uyghur why their mosque was torn down. Ask a Hong Konger what changed when protests became crimes. Their stories don't match the official Chinese version, and that's the point. Now ask a Chinese person why China is so big, and you'll hear one answer, because it always was. They'll tell you that China is one of the world's oldest civilizations, that foreign powers came in, tore it apart, and left it broken, and that only the Communist Party was able to bring the country back together and make it strong again. And with their own people convinced, they've now turned to brainwash and reshape how the rest of the world sees China too. And to some extent, it's working. China today is huge. It spans about 9.6 million square kilometers, making it the third largest country by area on Earth. But that wasn't always the case. A few decades ago, China used to look like this. Back then, it was just the land around the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. That area is what we now call the Han Heartland. Beyond that were kingdoms, empires, and cultures that had nothing to do with China. So how did it all change? How did China become so damn big? And why did they never stop? The truth is, China didn't start as a massive empire. For most of history, it was a collection of smaller kingdoms and dynasties, often at war with each other. Only during rare golden ages did these dynasties push outward and form something resembling a united empire. Over 2,200 years ago, the Qing dynasty was the first to unify the Han Heartland. But even that unity was short-lived. The Han and Tang dynasties later expanded influence into parts of Korea, Vietnam, and Central Asia. But they never permanently held most of the territory we see on China's map today. So let's get into the story. CCP's first chairman, Mao Zedong, was not a fan of this truth. That's why he decided to change history by repeating a false story. Xi Jinping considers himself a second Mao, and much like Mao, he wants China to take over the world. And I'm sure the CCP bots will do everything in their power to downvote this video, as to kill its reach. So if you guys can please hit that like and that subscribe button below, it helps us out tremendously in fighting off these bots. Alright, let's start. After the Tang collapse, China splintered again. The Song dynasty came next, brilliant in culture but weak in territory. It never controlled the north, let alone Tibet or Xinjiang. The real expansion came under the Qing dynasty, the last imperial rulers of China. But the weird thing is that the Qing weren't even Han Chinese, they were Manchus from the north. But during their rule, they built the largest version of China the world has ever seen. By the 18th century, Qing emperors had annexed Tibet, Xinjiang, and Inner Mongolia. They claimed Outer Mongolia and pushed deep into Central Asia. At its peak, the Qing Empire stretched from the Sea of Japan to the Pamirs, from Siberia to the tropics. That old Qing map ended up becoming the model for modern China. The Communist Party picked it up and made it their own. And now Xi Jinping seems to be pushing it even further. He's already done more than any leader since Mao. Xinjiang and Tibet are under tight control. Inner Mongolia has been reshaped to match Han Chinese culture. Hong Kong's autonomy has been crushed, but even the South China Sea, once shared by many, is now guarded like it belongs only to China. But that doesn't mean he's finished. If anything, Xi seems to believe his legacy won't be complete until every corner of the map is secured, and every trace of resistance, internal or foreign, is wiped away. To better understand this, you have to go back to 1912, when the Qing dynasty collapsed. What they left behind wasn't a strong or united country. It was a broken empire. The Republic of China was declared as the new government, but it barely held together. Warlords quickly took over different parts of the country, ruling their regions like personal kingdoms. The central government in Beijing had no real control outside of a few main areas, and the outer regions, like Tibet or Outer Mongolia, broke away completely. They acted like independent countries. They had their own governments, their own armies, even foreign ties. On paper, China still claimed the old Qing borders, but in reality, it didn't control most of that land. What followed was a long stretch of instability. From the 1910s to the 1940s, China was in constant chaos. Warlords fought each other. A nationalist movement rose up. Then Imperial Japan invaded. By the end of World War II, China was broken and exhausted. The north had been occupied by Japan. The communists had taken over large parts of the countryside. The nationalists controlled some cities and the southwest, and the border regions were barely governed by anyone. That changed in 1949. The Chinese Communist Party won the Civil War. Mao Zedong stood at Tiananmen Square and declared the creation of the People's Republic of China. The nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, fled to Taiwan. Now, China had one flag, one government, and one vision: to bring back the full territory of the old empire. At the time, Mao and his new government had inherited a country with loose edges and missing pieces. Many of the outer regions weren't yet under communist control. Xinjiang, for example, was being run by a local warlord and influenced by the Soviets. Tibet was acting independently under the Dalai Lama. Inner Mongolia had mixed control between Chinese and Mongol warlords. Even parts of the Han heartland, like Hainan Island and a few coastal islands, were still in nationalist hands. To Mao and his comrades, this wasn't acceptable. In their eyes, reuniting these regions was essential to erase past humiliations and prevent future foreign meddling. One of the first targets was Xinjiang. This region is like the Wild West of China. It's a massive stretch of deserts and mountains in the far northwest, bordering Central Asia. In late 1949, communist envoys cut a deal with the local rulers in the region. Instead of open war, they negotiated a surrender. A number of Uyghur and Kazakh leaders who were supposed to meet Mao died in a mysterious plane crash, an event that still raises questions. But overall, the PLA's entry was mostly peaceful. There was no major resistance. By December of 1949, Xinjiang was under communist control. It was a massive gain. 1.6 million square kilometers of land, rich in resources, and key for China's security in the West. Next came Tibet. Tibet was roughly the size of Western Europe, but it had been governing itself since the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912. The Chinese communists, however, saw it differently. To them, Tibet was part of the old Qing map, and that meant it had to return to Chinese control. In October of 1950, the PLA crossed into eastern Tibet. The Tibetan army was small and poorly equipped, and resistance was quickly overwhelmed. By the next year, Tibet's leaders were pressured into signing the 17-Point Agreement, a document that officially declared Tibet as a part of China, while promising autonomy and religious freedoms. The Chinese version of the story called this takeover a peaceful liberation. They said Tibet was a backwards, feudal place, ruled by powerful lamas who kept people in poverty, and that China had come in to free the Tibetan people from that system. But that's not how most Tibetans saw it. To them, it felt like an invasion. Their country was taken over, and they lost the freedom they had before. For the next few years, Beijing took a relatively hands-off approach. The Dalai Lama remained in place, and local governance was left mostly untouched. But that didn't last long. Taking over Inner Mongolia was a bit different. Unlike Tibet or Xinjiang, this region didn't require a military takeover. It was already leaning towards the Communist Party before the PRC was even founded. Just north of the Great Wall, Inner Mongolia had long been a borderland, sometimes under Chinese rule, sometimes not. During the Qing dynasty, both Inner and Outer Mongolia were part of the empire. But after the Qing collapsed, Outer Mongolia broke away and became a Soviet-aligned state. Inner Mongolia, though, stayed with China. Some local Mongol leaders in that area had already been working with the Chinese Communist Party. These leaders were left-leaning and supported communist ideas, especially during the chaotic years of war and revolution in the 1940s. Because of this cooperation, the CCP created a special political setup in 1947, 2 years before they took over all of China. They called it the Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region. It was the first time the communists set up a region meant to give limited self-rule to an ethnic minority within China, something they would later copy in Tibet, Xinjiang, and elsewhere. By 1949, Inner Mongolia was fully brought into the PRC, and the region's boundaries were expanded to cover most of the traditional Mongol homeland within China. With those major regions secured, the CCP cleaned up the rest. Hainan Island was taken in 1950. Some offshore islands were captured over the next few years. So when you add that to Tibet, Xinjiang, and Inner Mongolia, the PRC added millions of square kilometers to its map. To put that into perspective, the main part of China, the eastern provinces where most Han Chinese live, is about 5 or 6 million square kilometers. Now add Tibet, which is around 1.2 million, then Xinjiang, another 1.6 million, and Inner Mongolia, about 1.1 million. That's roughly 4 million square kilometers added from just these 3 regions. In short, nearly half of China's land today comes from areas that were historically non-Han and only became part of the PRC during the early communist years. China officially calls these areas autonomous regions. There are 5 of them: Tibet, Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, and also Ningxia for the Hui Muslims, and Guangxi for the Zhuang people. Put them all together, and they cover about 45% of China's land. So, if you ever wondered how China is so damn big, this is a big part of the reason. Once China's leaders had seized these vast lands, the next challenge was keeping them within China for the long run, and that wasn't going to be easy. These regions weren't just far away from the Han Chinese core, they were culturally, linguistically, and historically different. Tibetans, Uyghurs, Mongols, and others had their own language, religions, and, in some cases, a history of independence. Somehow, the CCP had to make these people feel like a part of China, or at the very least, stop them from wanting to break away. China tried to express itself as one big happy family of many ethnic groups. But the truth behind it was a lot harsher. The real goal was to build one single Chinese identity, and that meant slowly erasing anything that didn't fit. That's where the strategy of assimilation by design comes in. Cultures, languages, and beliefs that stood apart, especially those of Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Mongols, were quietly pushed down or stripped away. One of the biggest tools China used to lock these regions into the state was migration. Take Xinjiang, for example. Back in 1949, Han Chinese made up only about 6% of the population. The region was mostly Uyghur. But over the years, the government brought in wave after wave of Han settlers, soldiers, workers, even prisoners. A special state-run program called the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps was set up to settle and secure the region. More people followed, drawn by jobs in oil, mining, and construction. By the 1980s, Han Chinese made up around 40% of Xinjiang's population. Today, it's nearly a 50-50 split. Inner Mongolia saw similar changes, except the migration started even earlier during the Republican era. Today, ethnic Mongols make up only about 17% of their own autonomous region. Han Chinese now dominate the cities, the industries, and politics. Tibet has seen less migration, mostly because of its rough terrain and earlier restrictions. Ethnic Tibetans still make up about 90% of the Tibet Autonomous Region. But in parts of historic Tibet that fall under other provinces, like Qinghai and Sichuan, you'll find a much bigger Han and Hui Muslim presence. And since the railway to Lhasa opened in 2006, movement into the region has picked up. More people, more commerce, and slowly more influence from outside. Language has also been a big part of this effort. Mandarin is the official national language, and the state pushes it hard, especially in schools. Officially, there is a bilingual education, but in reality, local languages are slowly being sidelined. In Inner Mongolia, parents protested in 2020 when the government started cutting back on Mongolian language in schools. Similar things are happening in Xinjiang and Tibet. The argument from the state is that Mandarin helps with national unity and economic opportunity, but to many locals, it feels like their language and the identity tied to it is being erased, piece by piece. Even kids aren't spared from Chinese propaganda. From a very young age, they're taught that their regions have always been a part of the motherland, and that the Communist Party freed them from oppression. School textbooks in Tibet, for example, emphasize how miserable life was under the lamas, and how the CCP liberated them. There's little mention of Tibet's own political system, its independence before 1951, or the role of the Dalai Lama beyond what fits in the state's storyline. In Xinjiang, Uyghur children are taught that their people were saved from poverty, violence, and religious extremism, and that the Chinese rule brought peace and progress. Uyghur heroes, culture, and resistances are scrubbed from textbooks. In both regions, the national narrative is drilled into students from a young age. Everyday school life is soaked in patriotism. Children recite loyalty slogans, sing the national anthem, raise the Chinese flag, and hang portraits of leaders like Mao, Xi Jinping, and others in classrooms. As for culture, the state allows it, but only in tightly controlled, watered-down forms. Ethnic dances, songs, and clothing are showcased at festivals, tourist events, or propaganda shows to promote China's image of unity and diversity. But anything that hints at political identity or resistance is banned. Religion hasn't been spared either. The Communist Party is officially atheist and has always kept religion under tight control, especially when it's seen as tied to political identity. In Xinjiang, Islam is heavily monitored. Mosques aren't regulated. Kids can't receive religious education, and outward signs of faith like veils or long beards are discouraged. Some mosques have even been demolished or redesigned to look more Chinese. In Tibet, the state keeps a close watch on monasteries. Monks must attend political education, and religious leaders are chosen or replaced by the government. Even the next Dalai Lama, according to Beijing, must be approved by the Chinese state. For many Tibetans and Uyghurs, religion is a core part of their identity. The state sees it as a potential source of resistance. And when people resist, the response is harsh. In Tibet, protests have been met with violence and mass arrests. Even something as simple as showing a photo of the Dalai Lama can land you in prison. Since 2009, more than 150 Tibetans have set themselves on fire in protest, many of them young monks or nuns, calling for freedom or the return of their spiritual leader. In Xinjiang, years of anger, discrimination, and cultural suppression eventually erupted. In 2009, after long-standing tensions, a major riot broke out in Urumqi. The violence left hundreds dead. many of them Uyghurs shot by police or beaten by mobs. Instead of addressing the root causes, the government responded with a brutal crackdown. Security forces flooded the region, homes were raided, people disappeared, and public spaces turned into militarized zones. Instead of addressing the root causes, the government responded with a brutal crackdown. Security forces flooded the region, homes were raided, people disappeared, and public spaces turned into militarized zones. By the late 2010s, the repression had reached a new level. Leaked documents, satellite images, and survivor testimonies revealed the scale of what was happening. Over 1 million Uyghurs and other Muslims were rounded up and locked in what the state called vocational training centers. In reality, they were prison camps. Inside, detainees were forced to denounce their religion, abandon their language, and swear loyalty to the Communist Party. There were reports of torture, sexual abuse, and forced sterilizations. Families were broken apart. Children were taken to state-run boarding schools and raised in Chinese, cut off from their culture. These camps had one goal, and that was to erase what made them Uyghur and rebuild them as obedient Chinese citizens. From Beijing's point of view, the plan is working. There's no uprising, no war. The state has full control. In many ways, it looks stable. Young Uyghurs and Tibetans now speak fluent Mandarin, go to Chinese universities, and work across the country. On the surface, things look quote-unquote normal. But despite all of this, the tension hasn't gone away. It's just been silenced. Many still feel deeply tied to their roots. They still mourn what's been lost. They just can't say it out loud. Now, with the cameras on every corner, the police watching, and the fear of disappearing overnight. The state knows this too. The Chinese know that they can conquer lands with tanks. But to keep it, they need a story. One strong enough to erase memory. Replace language. Redefine identity. That's why the most powerful weapon in any regime isn't the army, it's the narrative. With this set, the CCP now began looking outward, to the sea, to old colonies, and to unfinished business. YouTube just dropped a mind-boggling announcement. It is paying creators $64 million per day. Why? Well, because YouTube doesn't have enough creators. That is why you see videos on your homepage that have less than 1,000 views, like this one. Now, of course, that doesn't mean everyone should start a channel, but if you have ever wondered about starting a YouTube channel, or a faceless YouTube channel like this one, well, now's the perfect time. YouTube is paying creators millions every day, and it's pushing newer, smaller channels now more than ever. But I'm sure many of you have questions on how to get started and how to grow a channel. We get questions in our email all the time from some of you guys. So that's why we've decided to put all of our YouTube advice into one training bootcamp for the low price of completely free. So, if you're someone interested in starting your own YouTube channel, you can sign up for this bootcamp by clicking on the link in the description or on the screen. Sign up now because, unfortunately, unlike YouTube videos, the bootcamp is like a Zoom call, so it's limited to just 100 people. Okay, let's get back to the video. The South China Sea stretches from China's southern coast all the way to the shores of the Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia. For years, Beijing has claimed almost the entire area using a vague, looping boundary known as the 9-dash line. On paper, this gives China a claim over 80 to 90% of the sea, including rocks, reefs, and tiny islands that are also claimed by others. China knows that the region is packed with oil and gas under the seabed, and it's also one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. About a third of global trade passes through here. Militarily, it's a gold mine as well. Whoever controls these waters controls a major gateway to the Pacific, so it's no surprise that China wants full control. The CCP didn't even bother with diplomacy. Instead, they went straight to bullying. First, they started dredging sand and building artificial islands on top of reefs and rocks that barely stuck out of the water. Then came airstrips, radar systems, ports, and military bases. Places like Fiery Cross Reef and Mischief Reef were basically turned into military outposts overnight. In 2016, an international tribunal ruled that China's sweeping claims had no legal basis. China just shrugged and carried on like nothing happened. Since then, Chinese Coast Guard ships and so-called fishing militias have been patrolling the area, harassing other countries' boats, blocking access to waters, and gradually tightening their hold. Now, let's take a look at Hong Kong and Macau. These weren't taken by force, but handed back by treaty. Hong Kong, once a British colony, returned to China in 1997. Macau, once Portuguese, followed in 1999. China promised one country, two systems, that these cities could keep their freedoms while being a part of China. For a while, that seemed true, but when Hong Kong demanded more democracy, Beijing responded with brutal crackdowns on the protesters, and by 2020, it imposed a harsh security law. Today, Hong Kong still looks like Hong Kong, but it runs more like the mainland. Then there's Taiwan. It's the most sensitive issue of all. Taiwan has ruled itself since 1949, after the Chinese Civil War ended and the nationalists retreated to the island. The Communist Party never took it, but never gave up on it either. To Beijing, Taiwan is a lost province that must be reunified by force if necessary. For Taiwan's people, though, most don't want that. They've built a separate identity, a democracy, and one of the most advanced economies in the world. And yes, China doesn't care. For years, they've been surrounding Taiwan with military drills, sending warplanes near its airspace, and isolating it diplomatically. Annexing Taiwan is Xi Jinping's main goal, and he's ready to go all the way to make it happen. So you finally see. This is how the CCP stole land. They called it reunification, but the world knows what it really is. A slow, deliberate genocide, dressed up as patriotism. From Tibet to Xinjiang, from the South China Sea to Taiwan, the party's message is the same. You don't get to choose. You obey, or you disappear. The people in Tibet, Mongolia, and Xinjiang didn't just lose their land. They lost their voice, their faith, and their memory. And all of that was buried under the red flag. Thanks for watching.